George will share a few thoughts about both Rowdy and Naya. And if I'm not mistaken, Rod, yesterday would have been Naya's 70th birthday?
Yes.
Right? Yes. So, please, George.
I know we only have a few, for me, a relatively few minutes, which actually is a challenge for me. And so the specific request for me to speak about Naya here was to comment on what I see has been her contributions to the TC, which is a little bit different than all of my memories and feelings about her. So I've contained those. I won't speak much about that, although they continue every day in one way or another. Soon the TC world will find out, will know about her, the extent and breadth and depth of Naya's contributions. There are a number of projects I know that Rod is working on and others to actually make manifest the writings, the videos, so that there's a real compendium of what the formal contributions have been. So that can't be contained in a 10-minute talk. I'm actually going to try to talk about her in terms of subtle contributions that have bended the arc of the therapeutic community evolution. They're probably not known, they're not really written about, but most of them come from my observations that came out of my interactions with her and how they influenced my thinking, and gradually, as I've seen it evident in how others have incorporated it in their work. So these are in the form of concepts that she, conceptual words, practices. But look, her impact in this regard was really in terms of the many roles that she played in this field. You know her in different ways. An indefatigable teacher, which I think is in many ways her number one role, a brilliant clinician, an inspirational speaker, an effective social political activist, but also in person-to-person roles. Her one-on-one roles, whether it's in social interactions or even clinical interactions, as a cosmic mother of inexhaustible generosity. Now, I realize that this is a little florid in the way I've described that, but when you consider her movement around the world in these various roles, we can't even record the influences in any meaningful way, but we know that they happened. And so that every time I would meet her, I would experience some of these. And it's important in many ways to understand that contribution in these general terms. And that's one of the reasons I try to give them kind of categorical labels. Her focus has been on those suffering from addiction, mental illness, and trauma, particularly among the socially marginalized, the incarcerated, the disaffiliated. Her influences on policy and people, direct and indirect, have been transformational and life-changing. Again, the measurement of somebody's impact on an individual or a field escapes us frequently. It's hard to detect it, except when you encounter it. So over some 40 years, 45 years that I have known her, I have encountered that with her, side by side with her or interactionally with her. But there are some specific contributions to the TCs that are evident that in addition to those broad categorical roles that I refer to, they come out of all of her roles. I mentioned some words that are conceptual, also actual ways in which she changed negative practices, what she termed TC warts. Of course, what she was referring to there is the traditional stereotypical, negative stereotypical views that too many in our field have had of TC, some of those warranted. You know, harshness, abuse, misuse of the word confrontation, misuse of the word encounter in the field, and so on. Things that I can talk further with you about independently, but all of that, those warts, she had something to say about, and she countered them by introducing other language. For example, sanctuary. The fact that her own programs, of course, were sanctuary bound, even though in some cases there were limited resources and settings to do that, it was always a first objective to create sanctuary. Her view of therapeutic communities had as its essential ingredient sanctuary. You know, and we know, of course, this bears upon words like safety, and that in turn reflects a fundamental ingredient of the success of the TC community when it is practiced properly as essentially physical and psychological safety so that individuals can ultimately disclose who they are to themselves and to others. So if your program essentially did not have some organized view of creating sanctuary, it was limited in her view. But also, of course, it was a word that powerfully contradicts some of the negative stereotypical TCs. My own comment about that is, you know, remember that some of those warts and all were justified, and of course we're happy that they have passed, but they're not passed enough. Trauma, the word trauma, you know, believe it or not, Naya and I, in some of our conversations over the years, that word came up very early. Now, this may be an obvious comment, but you need to hear it. And that is, we were talking about trauma. TCs were addressing trauma from almost the first days. So, and of course, why it needs to be said now is because now we see it as a kind of standalone, independent, evidence-based approach, which is correct, that it has been essentially developed and advanced by non-TC people and is very useful in TCs. But you should record for history that it was from the first days, there was already a class, kind of an agreed upon intuitive acceptance in the TC that if you didn't get to trauma, you couldn't have any stable recovery. And so that offsets the stereotypical picture of all behavior change and behavior modification and all that, all those elements. We had a view of that, which is that, you know, if you didn't make behavior change, you couldn't deal with the traumatic issues. You couldn't revisit them. We can talk about that at another time, but that was part of my conversations with her and the issues of, you know, the fundamental understanding of how people recover, which is they change first and then they deal with some of the deepest issues of their lives. Another key, again, indirect but potent change in the field is that the idea that the inner environment of the TC was critical. The physical inner environment was critical to the change process. Now, I had reminded her in a recent visit, a couple of years back when I was in LA and visiting one of the facilities there, which is in a dilapidated area of homeless, and it was so striking to me about how Amity had recreated in that setting, in that external environment, a different world internally for the clients that they were serving. Her eye for beauty influenced the interiors of Amity program environments, we know that, but furnishings, floorings, paintings, accessories instantly declared a different space. Safety, sanity, calm, peace, welcome, love. These, of course, illustrate the insight that the first meaningful psychological intervention in therapeutic communities is the physical environment. And to the extent, this is a brief commentary on that, to the extent that the TCs moving into the mainstream also involved working in physical environments were so deprived because of resources, you could not imagine what we were already, the deficit that we were working with. If the inside of the treatment program looked like the outside neighborhood, you know what I mean, that it was situated in, that was a great liability. Synanon recognized this when they tried to place in the early days TCs in good neighborhoods. So the inside world of our community is different from the outside. The first and constant message of TC is, of course, all about change. And that's the reason why that's a deep statement. It's not simply an aesthetic statement. For our populations who came out of a certain suffering and reflected a certain suffering, the idea that the very first thing that they would see is a changed environment is a critical but often unobserved intervention that we make. That's the first intervention we make when a client walks into a program. What that looks like, sounds like, and feels like is a critical intervention. A big area of change that she's had an enormous influence on, quite subtly, like below the radar, is the preoccupation with affirmation. Why? One of the classical, stereotypical critiques of TC is that it relies on correction. It relies on essentially, some people think, punishment. Well, we did have unfortunate examples of that in various programs. Of course, they're not as prominent as our critics would have it. But we did see it, and we do see it, unfortunately, in some not well-run prison programs that still go on. But even in the community-based programs and the well-known programs in the United States, anyway, there was both an inappropriate and an appropriate observation about how much negative correctional influences that we use to get people to change. Do we use too much, what we would call punishments or learning, contracts and so on. And even in our verbal interactions, are the verbal interactions too harsh? And what do we expect from that? Well, Naya early on was, of course, very sensitized to the issues of affirmation. And we had a number of conversations about that, influenced my thinking on this, and I've tried to write about that in some of the in the Red Book. But you need to hear it here is, again, how do you begin changing an approach by essentially capturing another view of a very important concept? Maybe we should shift to affirmational approaches, not at the expense of using essentially beneficial corrective strategies. Because here's an irony, and we're going to hear more about it, and I'm sure she agreed with this, is that without the correctional strategies, you can essentially run into error with only affirmation, all support and no correction and no change. It's not realistic. But the whole view of the word affirmation as being an overriding philosophical attitude toward the client and the approach. It's all about building, all about saying yes, and all about acknowledging positive change. I tried to, based on a lot of my discussions with Naya, I tried to essentially understand the affirmational process in a way that it could be trained and taught, not only in staff, but in the residents, of course. And the idea of making the distinction about the word affirmation having two components, namely supportive, just general supportive, but then specific, a second use of the word affirmation, specific reinforcement for actual perceived change, which the client needs to hear, because if they don't hear it that way, it's not credible to them. We can support and support and support all day long, but that won't bring about long-term change. What brings it about, if you're using affirmation, is the specific reinforcement. The way you are, first way you came into this program, you looked this way, and here you are 3 months later, and you look this way, and I've watched you grow in this way and that way. specific reinforcements. That came out of not exhaustive, but on-the-road discussions with Naya, and the concept that the TC going forward has to be an affirmationally approached program is profound, but not at the expense of judicious corrective teaching and corrective practices. Incidentally, I think a lot of the so-called corrective, is not contracts and learning experiences, but actually, believe it or not, is theory. When I would do recent training in prison TCs, we didn't have a lot of time. I was very struck by the fact when I provided the rationale for why we have to correct behavior in a TC model, a lot of those clients, their intellectual understanding of that, before they even got it emotionally, made sense to them and essentially increased their engagement in the process. So there's a long exploration we need to have around affirmations and corrections. Her effect, direct and indirect on policy. You know, she was a panelist and presenter in numerous venues at all levels of government, you know what I mean? And particularly the most renowned ones were the White House conferences, the things in Washington that she would appear at. And there, her splendid public speaking talents were very evident, because there she was talking to non-TC people and legislators and others. And to ask the question, has she had an influence on the arc of the TC, profound in that respect. She invariably, as an astute and ingenious producer with visuals and so on, and as well as her scripted writings, were unmatched. That loss, that we don't have that character in the TC world, is profound. From a strictly kind of practical point of view, you cannot imagine what we've lost in that treasure, that she was able to do that everywhere and anywhere. Research. Well, you know, we consider here she is a clinician and a teacher, and yet she was very, very involved and interested, intellectually, continually interested in research in every field, as a matter of fact, but certainly in TCs. And some of her early role work in Synanon was research. You know what I mean? She got involved in it very early. She was committed to that. And I made a note here that when the NIDA funded my Therapeutic Community Center for Research, we were able to, using with one of my mentees, a wonderful mentee named Harry Wexler, who was going to conduct a major program at Amity, which is the great prison TC, and would transform prison TC approaches. That program, of course, was so heavily, Rod and Naya, so heavily invested in the success of that program. But she was particularly always interested in not only politically using the data of research to advance TC, but intellectually interested in the research in TC. She wanted why things worked and why they didn't work. And so even, for example, aside from that landmark study at Academy, those of you who haven't read it, of course you should know it, it's part of your own education. But some other publications, one notable one was I had committed to the idea that as we got closer to reconceiving the TC as more teaching than simply treating, the idea of using the most skilled teachers in the TC, both residents and staff, was critical, and I call those the senior professors. And the most senior professors, of course, were graduates or even graduate staff who had moved through TCs and completed their TC experience. And we did publish a rather important paper showing that when senior professors are more involved in major activities, particularly frontline orientation activities, you can increase retention and treatment. She was deeply fascinated and moved by that. And essentially, wherever she would talk, I would hear some reference to the senior professor. There's one, I don't have it on here, but I want to, I think maybe I will end with that in a moment, but in terms of her influences in the TC movement on training and staff development, Well, that one, simply having access to her written materials on this and her curricula on this will overwhelm you. But in fact, you see evidence of the power of that worldwide. Yesterday we were talking about the Japanese effects in there, and her influence that way as a trainer and as a staff development pioneer. Extensive creatively conceived texts and videos, I mentioned a bit about that before, on curricular for both residents and staff with a particular focus on women to adjust for gender imbalances. It's not that there was women prominence, but the imbalance that we knew was chronic in the whole treatment field and certainly in the TCs. The only way that could be adjusted is by essentially affirmatively focusing on women, and her impact on the entire women's role in therapeutic communities is extraordinary. Not only in terms of the residents, of course, on a face-to-face daily basis, but on the wide-ranging training impacts, both formal and informal mentoring that she's had for bringing out the great women. One private comment I don't even have on this, but I got into the TC field partly because of a close friend of mine by the name of Zev Putterman, and that brought Naya and I closely because she was in Synanon when Zev was around, and so that essentially formed our connection. And it was Zev's comment to me shortly before he died. He was involved with Amity at various segments of his life. Was that he never appreciated the importance, the need, the meaning of women, not only in his life but in this whole field. But for Naya, who brought him to that, and then the Amity experiences he had in that. So that's a profound effect on women. In any biography, TC or otherwise, if they don't capture Naya or Arbiter, they're missing a profound individual in the history of the influence on women, particularly in treatments, not simply TCs. One that I was always struck with is in terms of a kind of social activism, how great involvement in public health and so on immediately got translated into Amity programs, and I'm sure she taught it in every program she went to, and that is it had to do with TC program elements informing general health, nutrition, climate change, and I think that Rod has been talking about, I think he's going to be talking about at this conference too, if I understand it. Look, I want to end, I haven't seen any signals, so I presume that I'm not over my, whoopsie, I'm seeing the two fingers right now. So I'm going to end this way. Look, one that again, of course, I'm going to keep talking about as long as people will listen, is her and I, our deep involvement, but certainly hers, where she made it very clear to me because she was on the ground practicing it every day. The TC, moving the TC out of the narrow idea of treatment and the idea that really what we were doing was teaching. And we, even to the point where we talk about, and she talked about teaching communities and as well as treatment communities. This is a profound step in the arc of the evolution of TC. We have to move out of the narrow concept of treatment and realize it's the broader concept of teaching people how to regain their lives and live in new ways. And of course, that's how deep and wide TCs really run when they are practiced right. That's tomorrow's discussion. But anyway, we've lost a great human being. And for me, some of you might have detected, and I've said everywhere, that loss has been quite unbearable. I have to share that with you. But I'm an old fetcher from years back, but it's an unbearable loss. But for the field, it's immeasurable.
Thank you, George. Thank you. Last but not least, we have Karen Biggs, the Chief Executive of Phoenix Features. Please. Oh, together. Yes, with Doug one. Okay, great.
Thank you, Faden. I'm going to invite Doug to speak first. He can introduce himself and I'll follow.
Hi, good morning to everyone. My name is Doug Bond, CEO for Amity Foundation. George, thank you for the amazing words about Naya. I'm going to speak more from my personal experience with Naya. I first met Naya when I was 5 years old. I was in foster homes and orphanages while both my parents were incarcerated. We talked earlier about the importance of family and the generational impact on community, and I certainly, one of Naya's greatest passions was supporting that. I was able to come to Amity with my parents for several years in the therapeutic community, and Naya helped make that happen. Rod, my heart goes out to you, of course, and love you and Naya dearly. Rod taught me a lot about the job that I'm in right now, and Naya taught me a lot about the role and the heart of what we're doing in the therapeutic community. And so I just want to honor her in that notion, and also really acknowledge the role that women play in the therapeutic communities. Our organization is led by an amazing group of women that are culture carriers, and Naya helped to really embrace that and build that for the therapeutic community. I'm going to read a letter by Jessie Lasoya, who is in the role that Naya was in as the Vice President of Services and Training. On this day, my friends and I remember our mentor, friend, and Amity co-founder, Naya Arbiter. I am humbled and touched by the time she shared with us. Yesterday was her birthday, and being here together at the EFTC in Glasgow is fitting. I know that she would be proud of all the good work that each of you are doing to build community. My name is Jess Lasoya, and I am one of her countless students. We work together on curricula, ceremonies, workshops, and creating community for the past decade. Since Naya's passing, the seasons have now made half of their turn along the circle of the sun. The rising light now falls, bringing people closer together as we gather and account for the harvest of our efforts. Naya's life was dedicated to teaching others and awareness of our behavior, our family history, our physical and emotional climate, how to create a glorious environment for the students and their families and children. We remember now how she planted the seeds which have borne fruit for so many of us. We remember the many stories from diverse cultures that have illuminated our past and awakened the deep and forgotten edges of our own root systems. Historically, in so many traditions, the autumn equinox is celebrated as a time of gathering, sharing, remembering, giving thanks, and strengthening the bonds of community which connect us all. Now it has become our turn to do so as she did, help each other harvest the gifts we have earned and received. She showed us how to do this for so many years with poise and dignity. Naya is our reminder to continue to share, learn, grow, and love. Like the cycles of our seasons, our grief at her loss, and the loss of many beloved friends, we move forth and evolve and change. The burning sun and the heat of summer fade as the mornings and nights grow cooler. Animals begin migrations, gathering in their own celebration of the changing seasons. The autumn equinox, with 12 hours of day and 12 hours of night, is a moment of perfect balance in the Earth's journey. This year, our autumn equinox is Friday, September 23rd. All of us here that knew her or appreciated the work she has done for the therapeutic community movement, may we pause in the silence and reflect on how we can carry on the good work of her example. I'd like to just one moment of silence, 1 minute of silence. Thank you. And now may we all continue to light the lamps of our hope for others and greet the poet Rumi told us, let the beauty of what you love be what you do. Onward, Jess Lasoya. Thank you.
You can't have founding fathers without some mothers around. But for a long time, it felt to me like the TC world was a male bastion, created by men, for men, talked about by men, to men. Now, don't get me wrong, they were and are lovely men. Compassionate, brilliant, funny, focused. But where were the women? Where was the woman's voice, the woman's story in the history the men like to talk about so much? It was invisible to me, and that made it harder for me to see where I fitted into the story of the future. And then I met Naya. My friend and TC mentor, Bob Campbell, pulled me into the EFTC world. And one day he said, "You have to meet Naya, you'll like her." And he wasn't wrong. George has talked about Naya's expertise, her deep commitment to the TC method, her ability to think and to educate. She has taught so much to so many. She encouraged me to be brave and to open those services that no one else had for women no one else cared about. And when I had to close one, she told me that wasn't failure, it was learning. And the time would come again to use that learning. And she was so right. She taught us that those founding fathers did indeed have women by their side who played a crucial role. She taught us that our role in the world was to be world citizens and to look after ourselves and our planet. Naya's legacy for me, and for many of the women I know, is the women's stories that she gave us, and her voice giving us a voice. My commitment to Naya and to our community is to keep her work alive through what we do, by sharing her words, her thoughts with others who will make their own sense from the inspiration that she gives. I love to watch women watch her speak, and I confess I used to place myself at these conferences so I could see the women in my organisation watch her. One of those moments was in Dublin in 2017. Now, you can go online and hear Naya say these words herself, and she does a much better job of it than I will. But I wanted to share some of them with you today. Women's work. Through centuries and cultures, certain work has been ascribed to women. The raising of children, the sewing of clothes, the emotional fabric of family, the keeper of secrets, mourners at the grave, witnesses at the crucifixion. There are women who wait, those who decorate, those who teach. There are those who do not appear in history. Women's work. Those who are ever patient, those who are counted on to be there, those who prostitute, those who serve as domestics, those who serve as ornaments. Those who bear the pain of childbirth and those who bear the pain of isolation. There are women whose friendships survive all other ties, and there are those unable to sustain female companionship. There are women who have raised their voices in sisterhood for themselves and for each other. There are those whose silence is louder than any spoken word. There are women who have paved the way by their independence or slavery, setting examples which guide and warn those of us who follow. Some women, liberated to competence, have opened career paths and possibilities for thousands behind. Women have been the first in their century, their culture, their profession. Women's work. An expression that lives on through centuries and cultures. Women, living longer lives each decade, often surviving all those we have loved. Have we, as women, improved our ability to live with ourselves? The woman's voice, the woman's song, what verses do we add as each year passes? That piece goes on, and at the end, Naya asks us all to open more doors for those coming behind us than were open for us. And for me, that's Naya. Some of you will have attended the conference that Kathleen spoke about earlier in Greece in 2019, run by Rowdy, Kathleen, Naya, and her partner Rod. And at the end of that session, we were given a token. In fact, each time I saw Naya, she gave me a frog, or an eagle, or a turtle carved out of stone. And I have them on my desk, and they connected me to her strength, inspiration, since we've started to get to know each other many years ago. As you leave the hall today, you're invited to take a pebble, small enough to carry in your pocket or to sit on your desk. The pebble has a tree of life painted on it. The tree of life represents the interconnectedness of everything in the universe. It symbolizes togetherness and serves as a reminder that we are never alone or isolated, but connected to the world.